Good morning and welcome to Bible study for today, Wednesday, February 10th. We are in the book of Numbers. We've been working our way all the way through the Pentateuch 1 week at a time, and today we're in Numbers chapter 23. Now, Numbers is the book of the Bible that takes place after the Israelites were commanded to go into the promised land, and then they said, no, we don't want to, too scary, big giant people, vicious people in there, too scary. And so Numbers is the time where they're wandering around the wilderness again, but they didn't have to. It didn't have to be this way. They chose to be disobedient, and therefore this 40-year journey through the wilderness is going to train and equip the next generation to go faithfully into the promised land. So here we have the Israelites have begun to take over various portions of the wilderness and near certain Canaanite towns. And they've taken over places in Moab, and they've had victory over King Sihon and Og. And now we have a different king who is saying, I don't want these people to rule over us. I don't want them to take over my land. So I'm going to seek Balaam, the prophet, out and have him bless my people. So therefore we won't get overtaken. And so Balaam had been riding. First he said, no, I can't go. God says no. Then he says, well, you're being persistent. I guess I'll go. God says, really? I told you not to go. So his donkey along the way encounters an angel of the Lord and protects him from harm. And Balaam has moved forward and he says, I can only do what God says. And so Balaam is meeting King Balak here now, who has sent for him, and he sent for him with the agenda of you're going to bless my people, but that's not what's going to happen. Then Balaam said to King Balak, build me 7 altars here and prepare 7 young bulls and 7 rams for me to sacrifice. Balak followed his instructions, and the 2 of them sacrificed a young bull and a ram on each altar. So 7 is the number of creation. It is said to be a perfect number. Therefore, 7 is going to give you the best guidance and the best wisdom from God. That's why the 7 sacrifices. Then Balaam said to Balak, stand here by your burnt offerings, and I will go and see if the Lord will respond to me. Then I will tell you whatever he reveals to me. So Balaam went alone to the top of a bare hill, and God met him there. Balaam said to him, I have prepared 7 altars and have sacrificed a young bull and a ram on each altar. The Lord gave Balaam a message for King Balak. He said, go back to Balak and give him my message. So Balaam returned and found the king standing beside his burnt offerings with all the officials of Moab. This was the message that Balaam delivered. Balak summoned me to come from Aram. The king of Moab brought me from the eastern hills. Come, he said, curse Jacob for me. Come and announce Israel's doom. But how can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I condemn those whom God has not condemned? I see them from the cliff tops. I watch them from the hills. I see a people who live by themselves, set apart from other nations. Who can count Jacob's descendants, as numerous as dust? Who can count even 1/4 of Israel's people? Let me die like the righteous. Let my life end like theirs. So this is not the message Balak sent all this way for, promised nice rewards for, and has already spent a good chunk of change with these 7 bulls and rams. And that's not just money, but time. It takes a long time to prepare these sacrifices. And then King Balak demanded of Balaam, what have you done to me? I brought you to curse my enemies, and instead you blessed them. But Balaam replied, I will speak only the message that the Lord puts in my mouth. And I underlined that in my Bible because I think it's important for us as people of faith to recognize there will be people who feel entitled to our words or who feel entitled to our actions because of their money or their power or their influence. And the people of God are called to live differently. We're not supposed to just tell people what they want to hear because they're very important or powerful. But we're supposed to be people who actively seek the will of God and discern it. And that's a challenge. That can be very difficult. You know, if your boss says clock out, but on your way out, can you go ahead and do that for me? You know, as people, we would say, sure, no problem. But that's labor fraud. And the Bible says the laborer is worth their pay. There are all types of ways in which people of power and influence will seek to skew what is right towards what they want. And they will use God as a medium and a means to do that. And so you have people who've quoted the Bible to justify slavery. You have people who have used God to justify oppression. There's a part in the book of Proverbs that talks about the poor are lazy, or the lazy will be poor. And there are people who've said, well, you know, that if you're poor, that just is because of that right there. Not to mention all of the points in the Bible that talk about how the laborer is worth their pay, and also that we should treat foreigners and Israelites the same in terms of wages and labor. So God isn't manipulated, but people, they still try. So then what happens next? Verse 13, then King Balak told him, come with me to another place. There you will see another part of the nation of Israel, but not all of them. Curse at least that many. So, okay, I brought you here. Here's the body of their troops, but there's another place. At least let's go over there. Maybe God will tell you something different over here when you see these other people. So Balak took Balaam to the plateau of Zophim on Pisgah Peak. He built 7 altars there and offered a young bull and a ram on each altar. Then Balaam said to the king, stand here by your burnt offerings while I go over there to meet the Lord. I do not envy Balaam in this portion of this day. Here you are with someone very powerful, wealthy, influential, and they're saying, let's try it again. And the implication is, and this time let's do better. This is the message I want you to hear from God. Temptation would be to appease the powerful king and hear what he wants to say. But let's see what happens. Verse 16, and the Lord met Balaam and gave him a message. Then he said, go back to Balak and give him my message. So Balaam returned and found the king standing beside his burnt offerings with all the officials of Moab. What did the Lord say? Balak asked eagerly. This was the message Balaam delivered. Rise up, Balak, and listen. Hear me, son of Zippor. God is not a man, so he does not lie. He is not human, so he does not change his mind. Has he ever spoken and failed to act? Has he ever promised and not carried it through? Listen, I received a command to bless. God has blessed, and I cannot reverse it. No misfortune is in his plan for Jacob. No trouble is in store for Israel. For the Lord their God is with them. He has been proclaimed their king. God brought them out of Egypt. For them, he is as strong as a wild ox. No curse can touch Jacob. No magic has any power against Israel. For now it will be said of Jacob, what wonders God has done for Israel. These people rise up like a lioness, like a majestic lion rousing itself. They refuse to rest until they have feasted on prey, drinking the blood of the slaughtered. Then Balak said to Balaam, fine, but if you won't curse them, at least don't bless them. I find this so amusing in the sense of Balak hears the truth in what Balaam has to say. God is not a man. God doesn't change his mind just because we pester God. For those of us who've raised children, you know children can be influential and persistent. And God isn't going to change his mind just because they've gone somewhere else, done another sacrifice, and asked again. God doesn't lie, and God doesn't break promises. But Balaam replied to Balak, "Didn't I tell you that I can only do what the Lord tells me? I tried to tell you. I'm bound and obligated to do what God says." Yes, Evie?
Did we forget the phone charger? I mean the tablet charger.
Yes, we forgot it. So you'll have to use your computer and not do Roblox. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. So we are here with Balak and Balaam. And Balaam, I can only do what God has commanded. This plays out more often in modern life than we think. In churches, there tends to be an influential group of people, and many times they are the people who give very well. But that being said, there are times when I, as a leader, the vestry as a group of leaders, is going to have to go a direction that disagrees with some people or disagrees with those with the numbers of money themselves. For example, we ended up cutting our ties with the SDA, Seventh-day Adventist Church, that was renting with us this past year. And that wasn't a particularly popular decision because they did give us rental income. But we felt, because of the circumstances of COVID, as well as the circumstances of this is a small church, and we had struggled to use our facilities to the fullest by coexisting and co-living with them, that this was the right thing to do. And so we did it anyway, even though it was economically costly. And fortunately, we discerned well from God that yes, this was indeed which way we were to go, because a group of lay people stepped up and volunteered for at least 2 years to give offset of the lost income. So we're doing okay with that, and God was with us. But the decision wasn't an easy one to make, and it certainly wasn't on paper cost-benefit analysis clear. You have to listen to God and be obedient, even if it seems like it's costly. So Balaam gives a third message because King Balak is really stubborn. And King Balak says to Balaam, "Come, I will take you to one more place. Perhaps it will please God to let you curse them from there." So Balak took Balaam to the top of Mount Peor, overlooking the wasteland. Balaam again told Balak, "Build me 7 altars and prepare 7 young bulls and 7 young rams for me to sacrifice." So Balak did as Balaam ordered and offered a young bull and a ram on each altar. By now, Balaam realized that the Lord was determined to bless Israel. So he did not resort to divination as before. Instead, he turned out and looked toward the wilderness, where he saw the people of Israel camped, tribe by tribe. Then the Spirit of God came upon him, and this is the message that he delivered. This is the message of Balaam, son of Beor, the message of the man whose eyes see clearly, the message of one who hears the words of God, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who bows down with eyes wide open. How beautiful are your tents, O Jacob! How lovely are your homes, O Israel! They spread before me like palm groves, like gardens by the riverside. They are like tall trees planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Water will flow from their buckets, and their offspring will have all they need. Their king will be greater than Agag. Their kingdom will be exalted. God brought them out of Egypt. For them he is as strong as a wild ox. He devours all the nations that oppose him, breaking their bones in pieces, shooting them with arrows. Like a lion, Israel crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to arouse her? Blessed is everyone who blesses you, O Israel, and cursed is everyone who curses you. So here we have the fullness of the blessing delivered through Balaam. And we see this interesting word in this chapter. He did not resort to divination. Divination is accomplished through multiple processes. We have people who attempt it with tarot cards or crystal balls. We have people who attempt it with the Urim and the Thummim, the items that the priests have to discern God's will, that give a yes or a no. All kinds of ways that people attempt to influence God to come and be present with them and tell them things. It's funny and important that it's only once Balaam stops, God meets him in those means, but once he stops trying to influence or control God, God actually reveals the fullness of the message. And we hear that the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, because it's in capitals, comes upon Balaam. So if you really want to feel the presence of God and be filled with the Holy Spirit, divination is not the way to get there. These other means might reveal some truths and lies of the evil one, but they're also not going to get you the connection with God. That is what we crave and also what will fulfill us and give us wisdom. So to have full wisdom, we have to make time to simply be present with God and wait upon the Spirit of the Lord. So what happens next is King Balak finally gets really angry. King Balak flies into a rage against Balaam, and he angrily clapped his hands and shouted, "I called you to curse my enemies. Instead, you have blessed them 3 times. Now get out of here. Go back home. I promised to reward you richly, but the Lord has kept you from your reward. So you chose to follow God and not me. I'm not giving you anything. I'm not, you could have had so much, but instead, no." There again, people will attempt to manipulate and influence you and your choices or punish you based on those choices because of material rewards. But we are promised that our reward is in heaven, and we can store up as much wealth as we want here on earth. It's not going to do us any good, and in fact can harm us. So Balaam responds to Balak, "Don't you remember what I told your messengers? I said, even if Balak were to give me his palace filled with silver and gold, I would be powerless to do anything against the will of the Lord. I told you that I could only say what the Lord says. Now I am returning to my own people. But first, let me tell you what the Israelites will do to your people in the future." This is the message Balaam delivered. So we don't hear Balaam have any sacrifices or anything, no divination. This is just what he tells is going to happen. This is the message of Balaam, son of Beor, the message of the man whose eyes see clearly, the message of the one who hears the words of God, who has knowledge from the Most High, who sees a mighty vision from the Almighty, who bows down with eyes wide open. I see him, but not here and now. I perceive him, but far in the distant future. A star will rise from Jacob. A scepter will emerge from Israel. It will crush the heads of Moab's people, cracking the skulls of the people of Sheth. Edom will certainly be taken over, and Seir, its enemy, will be conquered, while Israel marches on in triumph. A ruler will rise in Jacob who will destroy the survivors of Ir. Then Balaam looked over towards the people of Amalek and delivered this message. Amalek was the greatest of nations, but its destiny is destruction. Then he looked over toward the Kenites and delivered this message. Your home is secure, your nest set in the rocks, but the Kenites will be destroyed when Assyria takes you captive. Balaam concluded his messages by saying, Alas, who can survive unless God has willed it? Ships will come from the coasts of Cyprus. They will oppress Assyria and afflict Eber, but they too will be utterly destroyed. Then Balaam left and returned home, and Balak also went on his way. So here we have prophecy being given of the Babylonian Empire, essentially, is what's being talked about here, is that all of this is going to come crashing down against you, and Israel is going to survive this invasion, but you will not. It makes you wonder if they would have had that message if the king Balak had not been vindictive. I think it still would have happened, but I think, Balak could have enjoyed several more seasons of not knowing the fate which was ahead of them. But, if you get vindictive against God and against God's messenger, you have to be prepared to hear some unpleasantness. And that's what happened. So here we have in chapter 25, a failure of Israel, because we were doing well for a tiny little bit. So of course, now there's going to be a downfall again. And I believe that this pattern of success, failure, following faithfully and following away, it persists throughout the Bible. And it shows us that our fallen human nature is incapable of maintaining right relationship without the intercession of Christ. That's my belief of why this pattern persists. So while the Israels were camped at Acacia Grove, some of the men defiled themselves by having sexual relations with the local Moabite women. These women invited them to attend sacrifices to their gods. So the Israelites feasted with them and worshipped the gods of Moab. In this way, Israel joined in the worship of Baal of Peor, causing the Lord's anger to blaze against his people. So there are lots of clauses and beliefs about sexual morality and sexual immorality and what constitutes that in the Bible. We talked about in Leviticus, there actually wasn't the assumption of virginity necessary for all time, for all women who were coming into a marriage, or even women who had not yet been married. So this gives us a particular look at what is defilement in God's eyes. And this defilement comes by the women inviting them to attend sacrifices to their gods. The idea that sexuality is joined in with worship of false idols, and it becomes a source of the Lord's anger. And so, was it the sex itself? Possibly, but most definitely it was the fact that these sexual relations led them astray, led them to prioritize things that were not of God and were not godly. And so sex isn't itself the problem. It is the web that it weaves that binds us to people and things and causes that are not of God. And so here's what happens. Verse 4, the Lord issued the following command to Moses: seize all the ringleaders and execute them before the Lord in broad daylight, so his fierce anger will turn away from the people of Israel. So God doesn't kill everybody who did wrong, but God says you must take the ringleaders and hold them accountable for leading others astray. and they need to die because they have led others into idolatry. So Moses ordered Israel's judges, each of you put to death the men under your authority who have joined in worshiping Baal of Peor. Just then, one of the Israelite men brought a Midianite woman into his tent, right before the eyes of Moses and all the people, as everyone was weeping at the entrance of the tabernacle. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron the priest, saw this, he jumped up and left the assembly. He took a spear and rushed after the man into his tent. Phinehas thrust the spear all the way through the man's body and into the woman's stomach. So the plague against the Israelites was stopped, but not before 24,000 people had died. So again, this community is about 1.5 million strong, plus women and children. This is a pretty substantial portion of the people who have done wrong and committed great evil. There's also the questions of people who look at this passage more deeply and say, were they also potentially committing rape? Because if you are a conqueror going into a foreign land and you're bringing women back to your tent, did these women have a choice? Did they seek to manipulate the men after the fact into worshiping their gods so that they could have peace in their land and so their families would survive? We don't know exactly because that part wasn't written down, but we do know that what they have done angered God greatly. Verse 10, then the Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites by being as zealous among them as I was. So I stopped destroying all Israel as I intended to do in my zealous anger. Now tell him that I am making my special covenant of peace with him. In this covenant, I give him and his descendants a permanent right to the priesthood. For in his zeal for me, his God, he purified the people of Israel, making them right with me. The Israelite man killed with the Midianite woman was named Zimri, son of Salu, the leader of a family of the tribe of Simeon. The woman's name was Cosbi. She was the daughter of Zur, the leader of a Midianite clan. Then the Lord said to Moses, attack the Midianites and destroy them, because they assaulted you with deceit and tricked you into worshiping Baal of Peor, and because of Cosbi, the daughter of a Midianite leader, who was killed at the time of the plague because of what happened at Peor. So God commands the people of Israel to take up arms and to wipe out this particular Midianite clan. These are things that don't sit well with us as modern individuals. The idea of warfare and the idea of wiping out an entire population. Rightly so. We should be people who seek peace and want peace. But as we're finding out in our nation today, peace that is built upon false tolerance, meaning tolerance that says everything goes and all people are good people, is not a basis of a peaceful and just society. We have an obligation to denounce white supremacy and white nationalism. We have an obligation to denounce things that are evil. We have an obligation to not permit child slavery or human trafficking. We have those obligations to say that the people who do those things are evil and should not be tolerated or allowed to live freely in our land. We can't have peace without those things. And so this is God showing that the people of Israel cannot have peace with the people of Moab because their values are incompatible. And so this is what they do. It's not necessarily what I would choose, but this is what God instructs them to do in that moment. This is the best possible thing that you can do for your community and for your people, is to drive out this other community who is influencing them to destruction. We see this on smaller scales today with drug wars and gang wars that happen in our towns and communities. And a whole generation of young folks are lost to this life and are imprisoned um, because we've said we can't tolerate this. We don't kill them, but they do often die as a result of that life, either of drugs or of street violence or in prison. It's not something we want for them, but it's something that has to happen for the greater common good. And that is how I view these actions of God here in this time, telling them, you have to wipe this particular strand of behavior out and all the people who will encourage you to practice it. So we're gonna go forward now into another registration of the troops. Remember, Numbers began with a census. It's also gonna prepare to wind down with a census. We're gonna see the difference between how many fighting men Israel had at the start when they were supposed to go into the promised land, and now after all of these not insignificant rebellions, how many people are left. So after this plague has ended, the Lord said to Moses and to Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, from the whole community of Israel, record the names of all the warriors by their families. List all the men 20 years or older who are able to go to war. So there are on the plains of Moab, beside the Jordan River, across from Jericho, Moses and Eleazar the priest issued these instructions to the leaders of Israel. List all the men of Israel 20 years and older, just as the Lord commanded Moses. This is the record of all the descendants of Israel who came out of Egypt. So before we move through these, because I'm not going to read all of these names and numbers, I wanted to say it's significant to me that God places the age of war at 20, unlike our society would place it at 18. Or in some countries, even younger. There are child soldiers all over the world who've been indoctrinated into fighting for a cause. God is not in that. God sets the number at 20, and I think we have an answer in modernity that they didn't know why. Modernity, our science and our studies have shown that the brain is really not fully developed until your 20s, until your impulse control and your ability to make wise decisions even under stress and duress. That portion of your brain doesn't really finish forming until about 2021. And so God shows a lot of wisdom here, understandably so. God made us the way that we are, to say, let's wait until they're done baking and forming as teenagers before we send them off to battle. And so here we're just going to kind of read the titles, the numbers of the clan, and how many. So the tribe of Reuben had 43,730. And the reason that's a lower number than it was in the first census is because the earth opened up its mouth and swallowed the descendants with Korah. The fire devoured 250 of this tribe when there was the first rebellion against God, where they said Moses and Aaron weren't the rightful leaders and they flung their censers. This is 250 of them died in that. So the tribes of Simeon had 22,200. The tribe of Gad had 40,500. The clans of Judah had 76,500. The tribe of Issachar had 64,300. The tribe of Zebulun had 60,500. The tribe of Manasseh had 52,700. The tribe of Ephraim had 32,500. The tribe of Benjamin had 45,600. The tribe of Dan had 64,400. The tribe of Asher had 53,400. The tribe of Naphtali had 45,400. And so the results of the registration, in summary, all told, the troops of Israel numbered 601,730. And this doesn't include Levi because that is the tribe for the priests. They weren't to go to war. So in summary, the registered troops, they had that many, and God instructs him to give and divide the land in proportion to the populations, giving the larger tribes more land, smaller tribes less land, and each receiving enough to benefit their population, and giving it by lot. The tribe of Levi had all of the Gershonites, the Kohathites, the Merarites, the Libanites, the Hebronites, Malites, Mushites, Koralites. All of those are subclans and Kohath. And then they count the Levites from a different age. They count them from 1 month old or older, because we're not talking about men able to go to war. We are talking about men who will serve in the temple one day or already. And these are 23,000. So all told, this list, not one person on this list, verse 64, had been among those listed in the previous registration taken by Moses and Aaron in the wilderness of Sinai, because the Lord had commanded them, they will all die in the wilderness. Not one of them survived except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. So we have a completion of a season in the wilderness where a generation had to die out, and we see the numbers dropped a lot. And partly because of their own rebellion, this happened sooner rather than later. And so the rest of Numbers is going to be looking into going into the promised land again with these group and generation. So we're going to stop there, and we will pick up next week with the daughters of Zelophehad and what they are going to do for the Israelites. So I'm going to hit stop on the recording.